Recycle Zero Waste video series. Last week, we talked about recycling myths, and this week our topic is the problem with plastics. Plastics pose a lot of challenges for the planet, for people, and for recycling, and there are many reasons why. Let's get into it. The first problem we'll talk about is plastics' upstream impacts, meaning its environmental and social impacts before the product even gets to the store shelves. Plastics are made from oil and gas, so the extraction process is hydraulic fracturing, or fracking, which can cause air and water pollution, methane emissions, and exposure to toxins. Once you consider these impacts, you start to really rethink the value of creating something like a plastic straw that's used for maybe 10 minutes. Now let's look downstream at the impacts of plastics, or what happens after we use a plastic product. 91% of the plastics we use end up in landfills, incinerators, or in the environment, like in our oceans, collecting into continent-sized masses. By 2050, if our plastics trend continues, there will be more plastic in the ocean than fish. Plastic never fully decomposes. It just breaks down into smaller and smaller pieces called microplastics. Microplastics are now so prevalent in our environment that they're found in our soils, water, fish, food, and virtually all of our bodies. There's no escaping it. Microplastics were even found in the rainwater collected at a site 10,000 feet above sea level in Rocky Mountain National Park. Every piece of plastic ever created still exists in our environment somewhere. Plastics create significant recycling challenges. First, as a material, it's just not inherently good at being recycled. Materials like aluminum and glass can be recycled infinitely back into the same item without losing quality. Not so with plastic. At best, a plastic bottle like this one can usually be recycled only a few times. That's because, unlike glass and metals, plastic does lose its quality as it gets recycled. So it's more likely it will be downcycled, meaning that it has to be turned into a product like carpeting, which will then be landfilled after its useful life is over. Rather than being part of a circular system going round the recycling bend over and over, plastic cycle is ultimately linear. One of the biggest problems with plastic is how much is being produced. Disposable plastic products and packaging is being produced at a feverish pace, but only some plastics have recycling markets. If no market is buying a type of plastic, it can't be recycled. Since the 1950s, plastic production worldwide has exploded from about 2 million tons annually to a whopping 440 million tons in 2015. Plastics production is expected to double in the next 20 years and nearly quadruple by 2050. The reality is that recycling will never be able to keep pace with the increase of plastic production. With all that production, there is little participation by plastic producers to create recycling markets for their products. Manufacturers just churn out their plastic stuff, but they don't buy it back for remanufacturing. Typically, recycling markets are created by the industry that makes them. For example, producers of aluminum products buy back recycled aluminum to make new aluminum products because that makes lots more sense than going into the rainforest, strip mining for bauxite, and sending it to Iceland to turn into aluminum. It's less costly to just make aluminum out of recycled aluminum. However, for the plastics industry, it's cheaper for them to keep drilling and making plastics from virgin oil and gas, since fossil fuels are not only so cheap, but subsidized. To fix this problem, the plastics industry should take responsibility and buy back their own material, like glass and aluminum producers do, instead of putting the burden on the recyclers and on you, the consumer, to figure out what to do with plastics after they're used. Finally, knowing which types of plastics are recyclable can be so confusing. The recycling symbol is found on most plastic products, but it turns out that doesn't mean that the item is actually recyclable. Like we've talked about before, the recycling symbol is largely unregulated. The number inside the recycling arrows indicate the kind of resin used to make that plastic. So you can't go by the symbol to know whether it goes in the recycling bin. As always, which plastics are recyclable depends on your local recycling guidelines. But generally, there are some plastics that have stronger recycling markets and are healthier for you and the planet. The plastics you want to avoid are the ones with numbers 3, 6, and 7 on them. These are plastics whose production processes are toxic. They have health hazards associated with them when we consume food and drink out of them, and they're significantly harder to find a recycling market for. So, those are the problems with plastics. But there are solutions. We always want to reduce and reuse before recycling, but especially when it comes to plastics. But to truly solve the plastics crisis, we need the plastics industry to 1. Simplify the types of plastics they use. More standardized packaging makes it easier to recycle it. 2. Stop using numbers 3, 6, and 7 plastics resins and switch to making packaging out of the less toxic, more recyclable, and marketable resins. That would be your numbers 1, 2, and 5 plastics. 3. Take financial and physical responsibility for their products' recycling. Many countries and states either have or are pursuing legislation to hold plastics producers responsible, as well as legislation that reduces single-use plastics. As consumers, we should avoid disposable plastics as much as we can. But the real problem with plastics is systemic. It didn't happen because you forgot to ask for no straw. We need to work to change the bigger system. Vote with your dollar and be active in local plastics legislation. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
Hello, it's great to be back with our Zero Waste video series. I'm Randy Mormon, Director of Community Campaigns at EcoCycle. And with me today is Denver City Councilwoman Kendra Black. We're going to be talking about plastic pollution. So Councilwoman Black, to get us started, tell us a little bit about what got you interested in addressing plastic pollution.
I've really been struck by the incredible amount of plastic in our world. You go to the grocery store, everything is wrapped in plastic. Less than 10% of plastic is actually recycled. And we've all seen the horrifying images of single-use plastics in our oceans, blocking waterways, impacting wildlife. And even here in Colorado, up in the mountains, we see plastic water bottles, plastic cigarette butts everywhere. So the real solution, I think, is to reduce the use of single-use plastic and single-use paper.
Now, I know before COVID-19, you led the city's effort to pass a disposable bag fee. Can you tell us more about the bag fee and how it would work?
Yes, it's called Bring Your Own Bag Ordinance. So the goal behind it is to get people to reuse bags or just not use a bag. You don't always need to have a bag. It's a 10-cent fee on single-use plastic and paper bags. Similar laws like this one, the one in Boulder, Washington, D.C., Chicago, London, and cities around the world have been between 65% and 90% successful in reducing the use of single-use bags.
I really appreciate your work on that. Now, the city has put the bag fee on hold, as I understand it, for another year out of concern for COVID-19. And I think what we're really seeing happen is that the plastic industry is taking advantage of the current crisis, making a claim that disposable bags are safer than reusable bags. I know, in fact, they've even lobbied the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services to declare plastic bag bans to be a health threat. But I don't think the science is really there to back that up. Isn't that right, Councilwoman Black?
There's no evidence of any kind that single-use or reusable bags transferred COVID-19. In fact, the CDC just recently reported that there is very, very low risk of spreading the disease from food, products, or packaging, or any kind of surfaces. And recently, OSHA in California put out some new guidelines for reusable bags in grocery stores. Reusable bags need to be washed, but they're not transmitting the disease. And our bag law, we did have to delay it, but mostly the reason why was because it was supposed to start on July 1st, and our city was going to start a marketing and education campaign this spring, and we weren't able to do it. We're gonna kick it off next year.
I think we're gonna soon look back on this crisis and realize that one of the many bad things that has resulted from this pandemic is the resurgence of single-use plastic. According to recent reports I just saw in a national publication called Waste Dive, since March, we've seen a 20 to 30% increase in trash coming out of homes nationally. And we know that climate change and plastic pollution, these are problems that aren't gonna go away, and they're really just getting worse. We can't ignore them. I saw recently that the city of Berkeley, California has announced initiatives to reduce and eliminate single-use plastic by 2030. Once we get through this pandemic, what do you think Denver can do to further address plastic pollution?
We really need to take a hard look on how our habits change and how we can change them. But we also have to look at like what we're buying at the grocery store. Everything is in this plastic, and most of it is single use and very little of it gets recycled. So as a society, I think we need to take a really hard look at that. I'm really looking forward to kicking off the Bring Your Own Bag program next year. Pre-COVID, I had been talking with our own purchasing entities about adopting some city guidelines around using city funds to purchase any kind of single-use packaging. I don't want to ever see a meeting in Denver with a single-use water bottle. I will just continue to support reusing everything and just eliminating single-use.
I do appreciate your thinking that local government needs to set the example. Well, thank you, Councilwoman Black. That's all the time we have for today, but really appreciate your conversation and interest in addressing plastic pollution. And just want to tell everybody out there to be sure to remember to recycle and compost.